Welcome to the channel where all you gotta do is, well, explain stuff. Today's gonna be a little bit different. I know a lot of people are converting their old classic cars into electric vehicles these days, and the most logical choice is probably the Tesla drive units. There's a lot of them out there. So many cars, so many wrecked cars. Um, so these are pretty abundant and pretty inexpensive. But they do have some idiosyncrasies, so I'm going to go through all the different drive units that are kind of available out there and reasonable, and swappable to other vehicles, like you can control it electronics wise and stuff. So um, I'm going to ignore the Roadster because probably nobody is going to be able to afford one of those, and it's not the greatest motor anyway. So um, we'll ignore that one and start at the beginning, which is the Model S rear drive unit. So this is what's affectionately known as the LDU, which is a large drive unit. I believe it was subsequently named a large drive unit after they came out with the other genius name, the small drive unit, which is smaller. Um, but let's go through a little bit, just kind of where everything is, what the mounting scheme looks like, um, where the motor is, what the problems are on them, and how you control them. And there are several variants of this thing as well, so we'll go over that a little bit. Um, but basically, this is the axle shaft here, and there's another one on that side. So this is where the axle shaft slides into it. This side here is the motor, and this side here is the inverter. It's kind of a symmetrical design from an aesthetic point of view. That's pretty good. Um, and this is behind the axle. So the front of the car is this. This motor mount is at the front of the car. There's another mount that's part of the case that's back here that's not visible. And so this is actually the left side. The motor is on the left side on the LDU. And not all of them, but we'll get into that a little bit later. So these are your DC power connections. Um, and these things are pretty good motors. They have a few problems on the early ones, but most of those have been remedied. And um, if you look at the tag on what serial number is, if it has an R at the end of it, that's been remanded. And there'll be like an R1 or an R2 or an R3 or R16, however many times it's been remanded. They use the same serial number. They just put an R1, R2, R3. I might shy away from something that's been rebuilt 5 times, 6 times. That seems bad. Um, that's pretty rare, I think. But if you get one with an R1 or an R2 on it, that's normal. These things had some problems in the beginning. Um, they have a liquid-cooled stator and a liquid-cooled rotor. The liquid-cooled rotor has a seal on it that the early ones um, they had some wear issues and they would leak, and then flood the motor and inverter with glycol. Not good. Um, so those were fixed later. They also had some spline stripping issues. So the early ones, probably the first 2 or 3 years of production, had that bad spline design. But most of those have been replaced with an R. There'll be an R1 in the serial number, so those have been replaced. And then the later ones will have a common mode choke in them because they had some bearing discharge problems. And you'll see on the sticker, it'll say CMC on it if it has the CMC replacement. So if it was replaced after like late 2014, it will have a common mode choke, so you don't have the bearing discharge issues. So those are some of the problems with these things, but overall, I mean, the inverters are super robust, the motors are super robust. The thermal performance isn't great if you're going to try to do like road racing or endurance racing or, you know, a lot of spirited mountain driving. You're going to overheat this motor. Um, it doesn't have a great effective cooling system, but for some short stints to, you know, triple digit speeds, only on public land, not on private roads. It's fine for that, right? Drag racing, it's fine. Um, so that's the LDU, and these came in different variants. They came in a base variant, which is 440 newton meters of torque, um, and they came in a sport version, which is depending on the model, like a P85 would have like 600 newton meters of torque. Um, but if you got a later version and a P90 or P100D with ludicrous, then that 600 went higher. So I don't exactly know how, but which models have which ones. But this inverter and this motor is capable of supporting 700 plus newton meters of torque. You need the battery current to get there, but um, yeah, overall this is very very stout. The later versions also had a stronger differential. When they started pushing a lot of torque through it, the differentials would break. So they actually used a 4-pinion differential in the later ones. I'm not sure how to know if it's a 4-pin differential other than looking through the hole and seeing whether it has a single pin or a 4-pin differential. So I mentioned there's different variants of this. So um, this one would be an LDU from a Model S that sits in the back of the car. And then this one is still an LDU, but it went in the front of a Mercedes B-Class. So this is actually the back of the car. The motor is on the opposite side, and the motor spins the opposite direction. So all the internal giblets are different. The oil pump's different. The helix on the gears is different, and it also the dead giveaway is it has a parking pawl lock instead of using the emergency brake um, for a park. It has a park pawl inside there. So there's a bunch of little levers and balls and sprockets and stuff like that. Um, so this is the other half of that mount that you couldn't see on the other one. It's very similar to the one on the front, and then there's this third mount that kind of stabilizes it from tipping side to side. So it's a pretty, if you're putting this in a kit car or whatever, this is a pretty simple way to mount it, right? You just put a shackle around here and shackle around there and shackle around that, done. So these are kind of big and heavy, but they're like 130 kilograms, I think. They're hefty motors, but it'll make a lot of power. And if I don't know that anybody actually makes a ECU to drive the W242 version, which is the Mercedes B-Class version of this, because it goes backwards. But I suspect that's probably easily solvable, right? There's a couple people that make um, EV boxes to run these things, so I haven't actually called them up and asked them, but I suspect they could make this work. And these are kind of a nice option if you have like a Porsche Cayman or something like that, or something that's a mid-engine where there's a lot of room in front of the axle that used to have an engine. These fit in there really nicely. The LDU that goes in the back of the Model S is probably more appropriate for a combustion car with a live axle or IRS, and the gas tank's back there, and it just takes up the spot of the gas tank. So this is the side view. This is again the W242. So this would be the passenger side or the right-hand side of the car. This is the water inlet. So the water coming through here cools this jacket that cools the stator, and it goes out that way. And then some of the water comes through here, goes through a little tube, cools the rotor, and then comes out this guy. So we'll get into that maybe in future videos on how that actually works. But and then this is the inverter side. Again, 242. There's park Paul, DC power in. Yeah, this whole thing is inverter. So around 2016, Tesla came out with the dual motor cars, and those. Oh, let's look at the power curves first. So this is the LDU base, and all these power curves are kind of generic based on what information I could get off the internet. But basically, electric motors work kind of like this. They're a little different depending on if it's an induction motor or a permanent magnet motor, copper bars, aluminum bars, whatever. It's a little bit different in how big the inverter is, how much current you have, some motor controls, strategy and stuff, but essentially it works like this. You have full torque, essentially at zero speed, not really, but essentially at zero speed, few miles an hour or something, you have full torque. And that torque pretty much stays constant until you get to what's called base speed. And this base speed can vary. If you have higher or lower voltage, this base speed will be different. So fully charged battery, this LDU would have 400-ish volts, and the base speed would be around 5,000 RPM, which is 45 miles an hour, something like that. So as you can see, the power goes up linearly when the torque is constant. And then what you have is you have a constant power region, which is this part here. So this is the beginning of field weakening. And field weakening is not really field weakening. It's basically you're changing, it's kind of like changing ignition timing. So the peak power that the motor is generating as a generator has to be overcome by battery voltage. And at this point, you have to cheat a little bit to get it to still work as a motor. So everybody does it. It's a thing. It's kind of like not having a lock distributor. So this is your constant power regime, which obviously the torque has to go down to make that work. And then you get into this third regime, which is like less effective and less effective field weakening, and so the torque really drops off. So all motors are going to have this. Depending on the design, this this can change. The base speed can change based on obviously battery current or battery voltage, but also the design of the motor, how many poles it has, how many the way the motor's wound, stuff like that. But let's not worry about that. That's a PhD course in electric motors, which I'm not qualified to do anyway. But the LDU base, 400 newton meters of torque, 230, 240 kilowatts, something like that. Now, the LDU Sport, essentially it's the same motor, right? The motor's not different. It's just there's bigger switches in the inverter. So they just basically raise the current. Everything else is the same. It just jacks the torque curve up. And like I said, the ludicrous cars and the insane cars and stuff, this 600 can go up, here-ish, depending on what car that is. So if you have enough battery current and an aftermarket ECU, I'm quite certain you could push the limits there. You're going to break some stuff for sure, but that's where the fun comes in, right? So let's get to how to control these things in an automobile. So there's a couple of companies that make aftermarket ECUs, kind of like a Motec, or AEM actually makes automotive products for combustion cars to control electronic fuel injection and stuff too. So they're getting into this market as well. So this thing costs about $2,500, I believe, and it comes with this VCU 200, which is kind of the control box, and then you have to like take the LDU inverter cover off and take the basically the control board out of it and replace it with this control board, and then seal it back up, and you can control it. So pretty inexpensive, 25 or $2,700 for something to control, but this only controls LDU. You can't play with anything else. And I think it will only control the base model as well. I don't think it'll control the Sport. So if you have this indicates P for performance, so maybe it does. Maybe I'm wrong on that. And then, yeah, there's the prices. It's $1,000 for the control board, and then $1,500 for the programmable thingy. So then there's this other company that EV controls that makes this TC2 box, which is basically another ECU that you can control not only LDU, but an SDU or a 3DU. So this is pretty neat. It's 2,700 bucks, which is about the same price, but this one you need to have an iPad, which is gonna throw another couple $100 at it. But you get data acquisition with this, with the iPad, and this is like your kind of your selector and gauge panel, and like you can look at temperatures and stuff like that. So, if I was gonna buy one of these, I'd probably go this way. It's a little bit concerning to me that this is all controlled with Bluetooth, but noise interference and stuff like that. But I have to assume they have that scienced out. So, yeah, the next model that these are kind of chronological, but not exactly, would be the SDU. So this is an SDU front, and you can tell it's an SDU front by this torque reaction arm thing over here. So basically, this is what holds it in the car, right? These bolts go through this kind of part of, there's no subframe, so it's kind of part of the body. And then there's another bracket over here. So most of the motor weight hangs off of these two bushings over here, and then there's like a kind of a holder upper thing on this side. So this takes all the torque and most of the weight of the motor, and then just holds it up. Sends a little bit different cooling scheme on it. There's an internal oil pump that runs at proportional to vehicle speed, um, and then that pumps oil to cool and lubricate motor and the bearings and all that stuff. Inverters on this side, um, motors on this side. So this is the right-hand side of the car. So you're actually looking at the back of this motor. Um, remember that when we look at the SDU rear, because it's flipped around, um, just to make it confusing. I think if we go back a page and look at the controllers to control this motor, um, they're going to tell you that they can't control it because this is a front motor that was never um, released in a Tesla car as the prime mover of the car. It was basically the rear drive drives the car, and the front drive is like as extra acceleration, so it doesn't look at the pedal position. Um, the rear drive unit gets all the feedback from the driver, and then the rear unit tells this one what to do. So this inverter um, is slightly different than the rear. Basically, it looks the same, but there's some stuff inside that is a little bit different. But I'm pretty sure if you really wanted to use one of these, you could just put a rear drive unit, rear inverter on it on the front. And if this really helped your packaging out or something, I don't know why it would, but um, I think that's not an insurmountable thing if you really wanted to use this thing. Um, this is another view of it. This would be from the front. And because of the layout of the gears, the axle shafts, it needs this extra little stub shaft on here to make the axle shafts the same length. Um, otherwise, if you have a long axle shaft on one side and a short on the other, it'll be like driving a Honda. Every time you put on the gas, it wants to turn right, which is not desirable. Um, yeah, this is the view from the passenger side. This is torque reaction arm. And this is the inverter side. This is your DC power in, and this is your logic here. Not much else to see. Obviously, you got to provide some glycol coolant to the heat exchanger to cool the oil inside, and also these are glycol coolant loops to cool the inverter as well. This is a early version of the SD front, and it has a bunch of blankets on it, and that's not to keep it warm. That's to the first ones were a little noisy, so they put these blankets on to kind of quiet them down a little bit. I didn't really quiet them down; just made it so you couldn't hear it. But you'll see some like this. It's not really necessary unless you want something super quiet. And this is the torque curve. You'll notice this is not that different from an LDU base, right? It's close, not quite, but unless you start turning the current up on the LDU, it's kind of similar. So now that we talked about the SDU front, this is an SDU rear. Um, and this one is made to go in the same car as the LDU. So the motor is like, this is the front again. They flipped it around just to make it confusing for you. Inverters on the passenger side, motors on the driver's side. So this one will spin the same direction as an LDU. Um, this one you can see some of the coolant lines are still on it. So coolant comes in here. Um, it splits. One goes to the inverter, comes out of the inverter. One goes to this heat exchanger, out of the heat exchanger, and then they tie back together and go back to the coolant loop. So this one has a parallel cooling scheme on it. I'm not sure if you put it in a kit car, you'd have to maintain that. Just got to make sure you get enough coolant to the inverter and to the heat exchanger for the oil. So yeah, similar mounting scheme as the LDU. Um, there's a big lug in the front, a big lug in the back, and then there's a stabilizer thingy over here. So they fit into the same subframe on the Model S or X. So from the Model S and X drive units to the Model 3 drive unit. So this is the 3DU. Another clever naming. The third one goes in the Model 3, so might as well call it a 3DU. Again, you have to orient yourself properly. This motor is in front of the axle. So this motor is actually on the passenger side. And a different mounting scheme again. It has um, there's one bushing over here, another bushing over here, and another bushing here. So it's kind of a triangle. So this again is pretty easy setup to put in a kind of kit car scenario. How do I make that big? Again, you can see the coolant lines. This one's in series, right? So the coolant comes into the inverter, out of the inverter to the heat exchanger, out of the heat exchanger back to the cooling loop. So another thing you need to think about for a 3DU or a Raven or any of those drive units is there's an electric oil pump. There's a filter. You don't need to worry about that, but there's an electric oil pump that you have to control. So I imagine the fancy pants iPad thingy has a harness for that, and it's controlled appropriately, but I don't necessarily know that's true. I hope it is. This is the top view of it. You can see the heat exchanger better. You can see that's actually harness thing that goes on there. Kind of see the mount over there, over there. This one weighs about, I don't know, 85 kilograms, something like that. So this is quite a bit lighter than the LDU. The LDU is a beast. The LDU and the SDU are about the same, 85 to 90 kilograms. Yeah, not much really to see here. You can see that mount a little bit better. See the inverter. This is the logic port. This is DC in. And there's another hidden under there. There's another coolant line. And this here is the resolver. So to control this thing, you need a connection to the inverter and the pump and this resolver cover to control it. So that should be all supplied with the harness, whoever you buy the kit from. And then again, you have a very similar torque curve, right? This one's 440-ish. It's base speed and then it's constant power. You will see that this is a permanent magnet motor. The 3DU and the Raven are permanent magnet motors. So the torque in this field weakening stage drops a little bit less on a permanent magnet motor than it does on an induction motor. So that's just electromagnetics. It's just how it works. It's not a huge game changer. It's not like you may notice it in the car if you have really good butt dyno, but essentially they're kind of similar. Does it does have a little bit different gear ratio though. The gear ratios from the LDU is like 9.7, and the SDU is 9.3, and the 3DU is 9 to 1. So um, this is motor torque, so you're going to see a little bit less performance um, from the 3DU than you will with the SDU because the gear ratio is a little bit less. Um, so this is a 3DU as well, um, but it's the one that goes in the front of the Model 3 and the Model Y, and it actually has an induction motor. Most of the stuff is still the same. The housings are different for packaging reasons, but you can see this still has the same resolver cover on it. You know, similar bushings for the mounts. It's got the oil pump. It's got the oil filter. Um, Inverter is the same physically, less populated, but it's it's kind of the same giblets inside. But this doesn't have permanent magnets. This is an induction motor. And the reason for that is when you're driving down the freeway 70 miles an hour or whatever, the permanent magnet motor, you have to get into field weakening, which is less efficient because you have to kind of make the magnetic fields out of phase with each other. Whereas this one, you could just turn it off. Like there's no magnets in this rotor, so you can just like quit sending power to the inverter, and it'll just spin happily as a clam for quite a long time without making too much losses. You do have to, every once in a while, you have to turn the electric pump on to, kind of get oiled all the faraway places. But in general, if you want to make a car that has dual motors and has really good range, you want this guy. You don't want to put two permanent magnets. Not sure anybody's really going to want to use just this, but I think that EV ECU will control a Model 3 rear, and this as the that one controls this one. So I don't think you can control this one by itself, but you can control it through the other one. Close up of the resolver cover, and you can kind of see the mounting scheme is similar. There's a mount up there and there and there. Pretty easy. This is actually kind of a hybrid. So it's basically a Model 3 front with a Model 3 rear motor on it and the mounting scheme to go into Model S. So you see it has a torque reaction arm. This is to hold the air conditioning compressor. So that doesn't have anything to do with the drive unit, but has the same inverter as the Model 3. Essentially all the same giblets inside, oil pump, filter. It's just the cases are packaged a little bit different because the mounting scheme is different, and there's all the torque is going through the case and through this to get to this torque reaction arm. So their cases are different, but they're essentially based on the Model 3 front. And this is to this is an effort to improve the efficiency of the Model S because that one had induction motor in the rear, induction motor in the front, with the LDU in the rear and a SDU in the front. So this one has a permanent magnet motor, which are the losses in the motor are about half. So, yeah, she gonna bark? Just making videos. So, sorry about the dog interruption. Um, so yeah, this one is an intent to improve the efficiency of the Model S um, with basically parts that were off the shelf. So the motor, the rotor, stator, all that stuff is the same as the Model 3 rear. It was just packaged to go into a Model S. And then instead of having an induction motor in the front, induction motor in the rear, now you have a permanent magnet motor in the front and an induction motor in the rear. So you still get some benefits. This is actually a pretty good setup because you get it like on the performance motor, the P100Ds, you had a large drive unit in the back, which is a beast. But when you're cruising on the freeway, that turns off, and then this thing is super efficient at dragging the car down the road. Um, so that one hibernates really well compared to having a PM in the front and the rear. I, I don't know that anybody can make a controller or makes a controller. They can. I don't know if anybody makes a controller for the Raven because the inverter is, again, not set up to be a primary mover. It's made to be a, a slave to the rear. Don't think I can use that word anymore. Whatever the new word for slave. The master drive unit is the rear, and then this one is the not master. Yeah, I can't use master either. Damn it. Whatever. The rear one controls the front one. But if you really wanted to use the setup for some reason, I don't know why you would. You could put a Model 3 inverter on this. Um, it spins the same direction, so you don't have any problems there. And it doesn't know, right? You could take a Model 3 rear inverter, put it on the front of this, and nobody would be the wiser. I think the connector is different, but if you're making a custom vehicle, you can solve that. So again, another view of it. That's when you can see the heat exchangers tucked in there, and there's some packaging constraints. I'm not sure what this doodad does, but I don't think it has anything to do with the drive unit. It's just a convenient place to put it. So, all that brings us to now that there's this is like, I don't know, 2019 or something like that. There's a Model S and a Model X that you can get with a Raven in the front and either an SDU in the rear or an LDU in the rear. And the LDU in the rear is not so bad because it has a pretty small oil pump because it doesn't cool anything, it just lubricates things. But the SDU has a big oil pump because it cools and lubricates. And when you turn the SDU off and let it hibernate, that pump is pumping a lot of oil it doesn't need to when it's in hibernation mode. So this was a solution with basically, again, off-the-shelf parts. So this is essentially an SDU rear, same inverter, same gear, same motor, blah, 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 all the same stuff, except for this little housing that supports this heat exchanger now has a pump on it and a filter. And the stuff that was inside that was mechanically driven pump is gone. So this one you can control the pump speed at 0 miles per hour and you can slow it down at high speed. So I'm not sure if anybody aftermarket knows how to control these things, but that's why this exists. This is the SDU rear with electric oil pump. Here's another view of it. Same oil pump that's on the Model C, same 3, same filter. Obviously, a bunch of hoses to get oil or to get coolant to everything. So zoom in. So this one is essentially the same as a Model 3. The China-built drive units, some of them anyway, have a different stator and rotor. So it's a little bit, I guess, more modern. It's instead of a random wound stator, it's a copper, it's a hairpin wound. So these were made in the China factory, and I think they're sent to Germany and England and other places of the world for USA domestic market. These don't exist, but they do exist in other parts of the world. And they have about the same performance, but um, a little bit better cooling. But yeah, no real reason to seek this out and find it unless you're building a track car that you really need, better motor cooling on, something like that. But the rest of it's the same. All the giblets, inverter, all the same. Just the motor is different. It's another view of it. Somebody with really good vision cannot tell the difference between a 3DU and this guy. So, but I have a list of part numbers that may be helpful that I'll share at the end of the video. So this one is there's not very many out yet. So I doubt anybody is going to have anything to control it. But this is a 40U. So again, excellent naming convention. Um, these were put in the Model Ys. Looks like 2021 says here, and made in the Texas factory. Um, essentially, it's all new everything. You can see the heat exchangers in a different spot. It used to be up here, now it's here. But this fits in the same hole and does the same thing as the Model 3 does. Again, this is bar wound, so a little bit more modern technology, a little bit better um, thermal performance, and a little bit more torque. Um, and it has a different inverter on it. So you can see the oil pump is hung off this side here instead of it's actually hung off the motor instead of down here where it is in the Model 3 and the heat exchanger. So yeah, I doubt these are going to be supported by the aftermarket anytime soon, but they do exist. And I'm sure they'll be available to the aftermarket world or through the car breakers. You can see the resolver cover is a little bit different. There's a good view of the pump. There's no filter accessible on this guy. I believe it's inside, but the mounting scheme's the same. So theoretically, you could put a Model 3 in and later upgrade to this guy if you wanted more thermal performance. Which brings us to the hurrah here, which this is a beast. This is the Plaid rear, which is essentially two Model 3s, really. It's essentially what it is. There's some same motor that's in the Model 3 on this side, and same motor as Model 3 on this side, Model 3 inverter, Model 3 inverter. It's really hard to see. I couldn't find a good picture on the internet of this. But yeah, I say it's the same motor. It's not actually the same motor. It's the same size motor, but it has a carbon wound rotor. So it improves well, let's just go look at the next slide. There we go. So remember how your torque was like flat and then torque was flat and then the power was flat and then you get to here and then it starts dropping off. Notice this one doesn't drop off very much. That's because of the different rotor design. Less losses in the rotor means the field weakening is more effective at higher speeds, and you get a really, really nice power curve, right? So and there's three of them on the Plaid, right? This is each motor, so there's three of them. The Plaid has two, and then the Plaid Raven is in the front. But this is more torque, but the gear ratio on the Plaid cars is less. So that drops back down to about where you were before as far as torque, but you get a lot of high-speed power. So you just have to remember that the speed limit's, here. So unless you're at the Nürburgring, not really helping you much. I promised I would add some specs of all the drive units I talked about. So this is just what I could find on the internet. It's by no means perfect, but I think it'll be a good starting point for you. Thanks for watching. If you like this content and want more, subscribe, like, and share.